Hello, in this screencast presentation I'm going to talk to you about report writing. There are a few slides that have headers in red and they indicate tasks that you can get on with in your own time to help you develop your report writing skills for this assignment. In this session I'm going to talk about the assessment criteria and how you use the assessment criteria to structure your report, how you would use figures and tables and references. The assessment criteria are really important in thinking about how to structure a report because that's essentially how the piece of work will be marked. So it's really important that the structure of your report matches the assessment brief and that you understand the relationship between the assessment brief and the end work that you produce. A recommendation for this would be to use the subtasks of your assessment to help you to structure your report. So this is to do with the ordering of the report sections. And I would also recommend using the same wording or similar wording as the assessment brief for the subheadings. And that's because it makes it really easy for the marker then to see how you have addressed different elements of the assessment brief. And when you have a large assessment, and a 3,000 word maximum assignment is a large assessment, it becomes really important that it's easy for the marker to navigate the work, and using the assessment criteria and the assessment brief to define the structure is a really good way of doing that. I'm going to go through the basics of a report now. So we'll start with the title. A lot of people get quite hung up on the title of a report. It is really important. It's supposed to be short and informative, but it's also good not to spend too long worrying about the title of the report. Sometimes the title is set by the assessment brief, and sometimes you have to produce your own title based upon the focus of your work. Make sure that each section of the report has a clear heading. A report is different from an essay in that it usually requires a much more rigid structure in terms of things like subheadings and figures. Make sure that each of the subsections and the subheadings are clearly defined from the main area of text, so make sure that the headings are in bold, maybe in a slightly larger font, but use a consistent style for your subheadings and subsections so that it's easy to see what the hierarchy of work is in your report. Here's the first task for you to spend some time on working through this in your own time. So take the assessment brief for the module as a guide, and using the assessment brief, produce a contents page for your report listing all of the sections and subsections in order that you think you have to complete. Then have a look through the list of subsections and decide which one you think that you're going to try and write up first and which ones you think you're going to have to leave until last. The very last thing you do before submitting a report is add the page numbers to the contents page. So at this point you aren't going to know exactly how many pages for each subsection, but this is really to do with you going through the process of translating the assignment brief into the contents page so that you can understand the full scope of what it is that you're being asked to do. If when you do this you're not sure how to translate the assignment brief into a contents page, that probably indicates that there are some elements of the assessment brief that you're not clear about, and it'd be really good to seek some clarification from your module tutor about those areas where you have a bit of confusion. The structure of a report is really important. There's an awful lot of information that you're trying to get into this report, and clarity is a really key skill to develop in your writing. So each paragraph should have a few sentences. You don't want to have lots and lots of very, very short paragraphs which are only 1 or 2 sentences. That makes the flow of the report quite choppy and difficult to follow. But the opposite is also true. Do avoid having huge page-long paragraphs. Don't forget that the purpose of a paragraph is when the reader would take a breath and a pause. And if you don't give a paragraph break, then it's actually very hard to remember what the beginning of the paragraph said by the time you get to the end of it. So do try to read through your paragraphs and see whether you've given people a break and a pause to reflect on what you've written. Each paragraph should discuss one concept or one item. And in terms of the way that you lay the work out, so in terms of the text alignment, often we recommend that you use justified text alignment, which spreads the words out evenly across the page. It just looks, it's a nice way of presenting your work. Sentences make up paragraphs, and again, this is really to do with developing your writing style. So try to keep sentences relatively short. Each sentence should make one point, and the way that you can break up the flow of a sentence and a paragraph is using punctuation. But do be confident about your the punctuation points that you're using. So, for example, a semicolon is often a punctuation mark that's misused because not everyone knows how to use it. You can look up how to use a semicolon just using a basic Google search, but do have a think about how you're using your different grammar and punctuation marks. Ultimately, the report section should fit together in a way that flows. So often we talk about things like narrative flow, and that's really to do with each section leading on clearly to the next section, so it being obvious how they all relate to one another. And you shouldn't have to skip back several different sections in the report to understand what's happening later on in the report. So a report should be easy to navigate, but each section should lead on clearly to the next section. And there should be ultimately a story that, when we say narrative, it's borrowing language really from sort of writing fiction. So we tend to think of narrative in terms of fiction stories, but narrative is the story that you're telling with your work. And even if you're writing a very formal report, there should still be a clear story that you're telling and communicating. And you should know what that is. There should be a logical progression between the different sections of the report. They should fit together and flow into one another. So in your report, you're going to be reporting on findings from your research. Make sure that when you report on findings, this is succinct, so short and concise, and descriptive. So you're actually describing what you found out. You're not at this point going into any further analytical detail. Because then, after you've reported on the findings from your research, you analyse those findings using ideas and theories from literature. And what this does is it shows that you can deepen your interpretation of the findings by drawing on theory to critique the findings. So you will find out something from your own piece of work-based research, and then you will discuss and think about what you found out by comparing it and contrasting it to other ideas around a similar research topic from the academic literature. Here's your second task to work on in your own time. Go through the brief, the assignment brief, and identify which subtasks you think are asking you to summarise findings descriptively, and which ones are asking you to analyse or critique, i.e. present arguments and opinions supported by references to evidence from the literature. The purpose of this task is to find out whether or not you are clear about the difference between those different elements and where they occur in the assessment task. If you're struggling and there are areas of confusion and you think, I'm not sure whether this is asking me to be descriptive or analytical, then that's the point to ask for some clarification from your module tutor. It's not unusual, but it's definitely better to clear that up before you hand in the work rather than wait to get your feedback. Quite a lot of the feedback I provide on assignments at all levels is that the balance of descriptive and analytical content has been a little bit skewed, usually towards the descriptive. So it's really clear to understand what we mean by analytical and critiquing, and which sections of your assignment brief are asking you to do that. The final section of the report is a reference list. Reference list uses the APA referencing convention that we use at Sheffield Hallam, and it's the most common referencing system internationally. So your reference list should appear in alphabetical order by author. If there isn't an author, it's by the name of the organisation that published the report or the paper. There is only one list, so you don't have a separate list for figures and photos. Every item that you include in your reference list is something that you have cited in the text. So the difference between a reference list and a bibliography is that in a bibliography you include lots of things that you've read but you haven't cited, you haven't referenced them in your text. If you're asking for a reference list, it only includes the items that have appeared as citations in your report. So references provide evidence. You use references and citations in your text. So the reference is the long description of the text that goes at the very end. The citation is the short bit that goes in the text. Usually, as you can see here on the screen, we have, this is the citation. So in brackets, Smith et al. 2004. That's the citation. That will direct you to the longer description, giving you the full details of the source, which will appear in the reference list. The reason for referencing then is to provide evidence to support your arguments and your assertions. It's also there to signpost the reader if they want to go and find out a bit more about the thing that you've been talking about. You can go and explore the reference list. And it's also a way of avoiding plagiarism. So it makes it very clear when you are talking about somebody else's ideas, and if you don't cite work, the assumption is that you're talking about your own research work. So that's why we encourage you to use references and citations, because most of the time we are actually discussing ideas that we've got from our reading, and it makes it distinct and clear then when we're actually discussing our own research findings. Ultimately, referencing is a signal for the quality and depth of your reading as well. So the citations that you use and the reference list at the end is a way that we can get an indication of how much you've read and how you've interpreted and applied things that you've read. In a report, we ask you to include figures and tables. So figures and tables include charts, bar charts, tables of information, visuals of any kind, maps, diagrams, that kind of thing. So the key feature of a figure is it needs to be clear. So you need to, if you're including the figure because you want your reader to be able to understand the information in it, make sure that it's at a resolution that is really clear and you can read all of the information, that it's neat and not cluttered, that it's informative, that it's integrated well into the text. So it shouldn't just be there for interest, it should be specifically referred to in the text, and we should be able to, and it should be clear why you're asking us to look at that figure. So you mention the figure in the text and then you make sure that you place the figure after that first mention. Figures need to be labelled. So we have things called a figure caption, which describes what is in the figure that we're looking at. An example here on the right. If we're actually putting a figure caption, which sits underneath the figure usually, it doesn't also need a title. So the figure caption tells us what the figure is and what we're looking at. Here's another example of a table of data, and you can see underneath it there the figure caption, figure 3, HIA, Health Impact Assessment Threshold Analysis Score Sheet. And this area at the bottom here, you can see this is the reference that it's referring to. So that's the source of the information. If you have made the figure or the table using your own data, it doesn't need a reference. So if there is no reference there, we assume that you created that table. So again, that's really important in terms of plagiarism and clarity. If the figure is taken from another paper, it does need a reference in the caption. So the example would be planning application appeals by area, for example, would have a citation there in the caption. If you create your own table or chart, but you use somebody else's data, then you need to acknowledge the data in the caption. So you may have created a figure, but actually it's based upon data, secondary data that you've taken from somewhere else. All those scenarios are absolutely fine in terms of research methods, but it's just got to be clear in the way that you label and caption your figures, whether it's one you've produced yourself, whether the data was your own, or whether you've used secondary data. So in summary then, start with the structure of your report and base that structure on the assignment brief, so it's really clear to you and to the person that marks your work that you have covered everything in that brief. Make it clear when you are describing your findings and when you're analysing your findings, so you can make sure that you're doing both of those things. This is a common area of confusion, so don't be worried if at the moment it doesn't seem very clear. This is the point at which you can identify what it is that you're confused about and ask those questions. Remember to include figures and references and to label that information clearly and include an accurate reference list so that we can see what you've read and the evidence that you're using to support your work and you don't get accused of plagiarism. Thank you very much.